Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rabbi Levine. Welcome to the course entitled Journey of the Soul. It's a 3-part course, which means it will be going on for the next 2 weeks. And it's meant to give you an overview of understanding the journey of the soul, beginning with where the soul comes from, how it's prepared for its mission when God sends the soul into this world to vest itself into a body, the mission itself, what the mission is, and how one is meant to go through the challenges that life presents itself, and ultimately what takes place when the mission is over, and the journey of the soul back to heaven, and what greets the soul there. There are many subject matters in Judaism that if you were to ask people to define these subject matters, many people will have different responses. Particularly when we speak about very aloof and very sublime subject matters, like what is God, or what is a soul, or do we believe in hell? What is hell or heaven? Do we believe in reincarnation? How would you define reincarnation? So when we speak about a soul, it's important for us to have the right wording, the right definition, so that if somebody asks you, in Judaism, do you believe in a soul, or do you believe in an afterlife? Do you believe in heaven or hell, or so on and so forth, that you have the right words, how to express these ideas. Some of the other religions, they've kind of taken over this subject matter. So for many, the view of these subjects are through the lenses of that particular religion. So what do they know about reincarnation? Either something that they heard from a friend, something they read in a book, or a movie that they watched that depicted the concept of reincarnation. That doesn't necessarily mean that this is the way Judaism defines reincarnation. So if somebody asks you, do you believe in reincarnation, and you heard that Judaism does believe in reincarnation, it doesn't necessarily mean the way you're imagining what reincarnation is all about. The same thing with heaven or hell. Somebody asks you, does Judaism believe in hell? You say, I think so. Well, what is it? How would you define it? Is it some, endless fiery pit that you're lowered there with some devils and pitchforks and so on and so forth? Is that your description of hell? Or is heaven some lakeshore front, living in a big, beautiful mansion, sitting down with a margarita right next to a casino? Is that your image of what heaven is all about? So when it comes to these subject matters, it's important for us to recognize how we define these abstract, these very spiritual concepts. Tonight, the first part of the lesson, the first part of the course actually, is going to delve into what is a soul, and the preparation of the soul to come into this world and begin its mission. So where does the soul come from? How do we define the soul? How is it prepared for this mission? And that would lead us to next week's lesson, where we'll talk about the actual mission. Now that the soul's in the body, what it experiences while it's here as a living human being, how it faces the challenges of life, how it communicates with the person, And then ultimately that will lead us into the completion of the mission and the journey of the soul back into the what we call the afterlife or the higher life of the soul. So we begin by asking ourselves a question of who am I? Also not a very simple question to answer. If somebody would say, who are you? You'll probably say your name, your neighborhood, maybe your employment, maybe your religion, maybe your family life. But sometimes the question is really asking for something deeper than that. It's like asking the question, what is this that all my items are on top of? You can answer it's a table, but the person's not interested in the name of it. I want to know what it is. Oh, that's what you mean. Okay, it's not. It's a piece of wood. What is it? Which is really implying, where does the wood come from? It's coming from a tree. What is the wood? Oh, like the molecular field? Like you want to know about protons and neutrons, and is that what you want to know how much air there is in this? Yeah. Well, deeper than that. So the question of what something is can be answered on multiple levels. Similarly, the question of who are you can also be answered on multiple levels. When we delve into the mysteries in Judaism, known as the Kabbalah, it's the deepest, most mystical dimension of Judaism. That's all those subject matters are discussed in that part of Judaism. Jewish mysticism has a term called mahut. Mahut. What is the mahut of something? That's what the entire Kabbalah deals with. What is the mahut of the tree? What is the mahut of the person? What is the mahut of God? Now the word mahut comes from the word mahu. Mahu means what is it? But when we talk in terms of Kabbalah, mahut, we're referring to the deepest identity of that particular existence. We're not just asking superficially what it is, we're asking what is the essence of this matter. And Kabbalah deals with the core, the essential core of that particular existence.
Is that the answer to who am I?
Yes.
Mahut?
Mm-hmm. In other words, if somebody asks you what is the mahut of the human being, it's not looking that you'd say your name or where you live or what type of house you're living in or the car that you're driving or your sports picks or your political party. It's not looking for that. It's looking for what's your essence. And as we begin to realize that the more we dig within ourselves to answer that question, the less we find it easy to express and to answer that question. Because we live very... What? The less easy, right. The less easy it becomes. Because many of us that live superficial lives, that's what we're engaging in constantly, and that's what we're into. So, to answer the question of who am I, we can talk all about that superficiality. But when we're talking about the essence, then you need to really describe who you are internally. What makes you different than the person next to you? In other words, if you're going to describe yourself as a person living in Beverly Hills, well, there's somebody else living in Beverly Hills too. Oh, you're a doctor in Beverly Hills. Well, there's another doctor living in Beverly Hills too. You drive a Mercedes, so does he. So what makes you different than him? Oh, characteristic traits. Okay. Well, I'm a kind person. Well, now we're getting somewhere. We're getting into the deeper element of your existence. So if you're a philosophical-minded type of person, and some people are, you probably often wonder about the mystery of what we call life, or who we are really. We begin to think about, a mix of cells and a surging of chemicals and electrical impulses that give us life. And we begin to start analyzing this, thinking, well, where does the self emerge from this, mount of chemicals and impulses?
The mahut can be also the DNA that is individual.
In other words, what is the design? What is the makeup? What is the building blocks that make you into what you are? If you're a more practical natured person and you're more pragmatic, then you go through life thinking of matters of like, what do I want to eat for lunch today? Do I need to fill up my car with gas? How do I want to spend my vacation? And we don't really think about the deeper parts of our existence or the deeper reality of life. But there are certain times that there are things that kind of force us to ask this question. You find it when people get sick or people lose a loved one, that they begin to ask the question, who am I? I remember when I first moved here to California, one of the first calls that I received is a woman who wanted to speak to a rabbi because she had just lost a good friend of hers, a very close friend, a childhood friend. And unfortunately, she was taken way too early. And she was trying to express on the phone why she wanted to speak to a rabbi. She is Jewish, but she really never had any involvement in Judaism. But she just wants to know where her friend is now. And she just finds no rest. She needs to know the answer. When a person is faced with, God forbid, a terminally ill disease where they see their mortality, they begin to face the unavoidable death. Most people don't think about it. But when you're faced with that question, you begin to start asking these questions. Who am I? And do we believe in eternity? Is there a part of me that is eternal? Do I continue to exist? And if so, where am I going? Now, for many, when the experiences of life begin to dwindle, we can't do what we used to do. We're getting older. Or God forbid that we're battling with an illness. We're not jumping around, touring Europe and having a good time. All of a sudden now, we don't have that luxury. In fact, some people that get older, they find it very hard to leave their homes. They're not going out to restaurants any longer. They're not going to comedy clubs. They're not going out to work out in gyms any longer. So all of those experiences that they had throughout life that really took up most of their time, now they have all this free time and they begin to ask the question, what is life? Because they're no longer involved with the experiences of life. Because a person can be very harried and very, very busy with the experience of life. He doesn't stop to think about what life is. But once those experiences begin to be taken away from him or her, that's when you begin to ask the question. I recognize this as a rabbi when I saw that the attentiveness or the curiosity of people that were terminally ill in a hospital, where they really wanted to know who they are and if we believe in a soul and what is the afterlife about, I come to recognize because they're terminally ill. And now they're faced with this question. I also go to visit prison systems. And there as well, I find a very, I like to say, captive audience that ask the question, what is life? Those type of questions that you generally don't hear. People want to know what they have to do, the practice, the experience, but they're not asking the question of the fundamental of what is life. They're asking about the experiences of life. Yes.
How can we know what afterlife is? Nobody has gone and come back and told us.
Well, we actually are going to talk a little bit about those that do have some NDE experiences, near-death experiences, which we will talk about. But ultimately, to really answer your question, is that what we have is just a tradition of the Torah that was handed down from generation to generation that had these teachings. And it's kind of that had these teachings. And in other words, it's really a belief system. You're right. You know, somebody goes to visit Australia and comes back and tell you all about it. And then you go ahead and know that Australia exists because you met the person that actually went there, describes it, comes back, and tells you all about it. We really don't have those stories. So, a lot of it is belief. A lot of it is what was handed down to us, this chain of knowledge that we call a Torah, an oral Torah that was passed down, transmitted from generation to generation, that has in it these mystical teachings, and somehow every other culture and religion took it from Judaism. We are the oldest religion that had these subject matters, and all of the other religions took those subject matters as well, adapted it to their religion. But ultimately it is a faith base. You're absolutely right. But we will talk about those that actually did come back. A classic story that really identifies when you ask the question of who am I, when you stop and really think about your existence and your identity, is a story that happened with the first Chabad rabbi. His name is Rabbi Shneur Zalman, lived about 250 years ago. He raised his grandson. His daughter, which is the mother of his grandson, had passed on very early, and he made a promise to her that he will raise this child, who ultimately became one of his successors, another Rebbe of Chabad down in the dynasty. So this young boy, whose name was Mendel, he was looked after by his grandfather, the rabbi. And when the boy was like 8 or 9 years old, and he would spend a lot of time with his grandfather, and his grandfather taught him and educated him. At one point, the grandfather turned to his grandson and asked the question in Yiddish, "Vu is Zayde?" Where is Zaydi? Where is Grandpa? So the child, sitting on the grandfather's lap, now grabbed onto his face, or his beard, and he says, "Here's Zaydi." He goes, "No, this is Zaydi's beard." And then the child grabbed onto his hands, and he says, "This is Zaydi's hands." He grabbed onto his head, and he goes, "This is Zaydi's head. But where is Zaydi?" The kid saw that he's not going to please his grandfather, and then after a little while, he left the room, and as he left the room and the door closed, he gave a wail out like, "Ow!" as if he caught his finger in the door. And the grandfather immediately turned around and said, "Mendel!" And he goes, "That's Zayde." He answered the question, where his entire being turned around and focused and directed its attention. That is Zayde. There's another story of a very famous Hasidic master whose name was Rabbi Zusha. Came from a city known as Annapolis. He was the brother of the very famous Rabbi Elimelech of Lizhensk. Those old-timers that you know the song in Yiddish, "When the Rebbe, Rabbi Elimelech, tanzen alle Hasidim." So this was his brother, Rabbi Zusha of Annapolis. So Rabbi Zusha once was in his cabin, in his home, and he was pacing back and forth, and some of his students were passing by, and they noticed that their rabbi was pacing back and forth in his home. So they came a little closer to see what was going on, and they heard the rabbi saying, "Where is Zusha? Where is Zusha?" Now, normally, such a scenario would prompt you to take this man and bring him to a psychiatric ward. Because he is Zusha, and he's walking around kind of looking for himself. Where is Zusha? So when they came in and they said, "Rebbe, Rabbi, teacher, what are you saying, where is Zusha? You are Zusha." He says, "That's not what I mean. That's not what I was asking, the question of where is Zusha. And then he tells the students, imagine, one day, unfortunately, when my soul is going to be leaving my body, I'm going to die. He says, you're going to come here, and you're going to see my body on the floor. And you're going to begin to cry and say, "Hey, where is Reb Zusha? Where is Reb Zusha?" Even though you're going to see my body there, you're still going to come and ask the question, where is Reb Zusha? That's the Zusha that I was looking for. Sometimes we identify ourselves with our bodies, with our external features. Again, back to the original question, who are you? When we begin to talk about the more external parts of our existence, but when we talk about the soul, we're trying to identify the real core essence, the real identity of who we really are. Now, this young woman asked the question about where this knowledge is coming from. It's not like we have many people that have come back from the afterlife telling us the stories that, the soul does exist and there's an afterlife and I can prove it and I can tell you all about it. We don't really have those stories. However, we do have stories that we've all heard, and we can deny them, or we can say, there's too many likenesses to people's experiences in every culture, in every nationality, in every religion, people that have this experience where maybe they were under surgery, they were under the knife, and all of a sudden they felt themselves leaving their bodies, and then they came back. And they all seem to have a very similar description of what they felt and what they experienced. In fact, in the early 1990s, there was a book that was written by an Israeli woman. You can check it up. Her name is Rachel Noam. Ever heard that name? Noam. N-O-A-M. She authored a book. One of the first books that I've ever read about NDE, about near-death experience, was written by a Jewish woman that had an event in Tel Aviv. And she wrote a book called The View from Above. You ever heard of it? What had taken place is that she was walking on one of the streets in Tel Aviv, and unfortunately, from the scaffold where they were building, a huge 12 to 15 foot beam fell off the scaffold and landed on her. And she has fallen down to the ground. And in her book she describes that she felt herself, but she was like 15 feet above the ground, looking at herself, looking at her body on the ground. She sees her body lifeless. She sees this woman running to her to check any signs of life. And in her book, ultimately she ended up coming back into her body, but that perspective and that experience changed her life. She recognized that the I in me is not my body, but rather it's some type of energy force that is in my body. And my body is just a vehicle, is just a vessel in which the I is able to express itself here in this world. So, if you were to look at body and soul and identify it as the body doesn't have life. The body is a vessel. The body is a channel in which the soul, that's the you, comes into, and all of a sudden the body appears to have life because it's the soul that's inside of the body. In fact, when a person passes on, we find many, many references in Judaism. We refer to the person that passed on as niftar. You heard that? Niftar. What is niftar? Lipater. What does the word niftar mean? It has a connotation of lipater. It's like a separation of one kind of leaving the other and
quitting. Quitting.
Well, one kind of finally being exempt from the other, finally ridding himself. When your mother-in-law comes to visit for 3 weeks and finally she's going back, you use the word lipater. In other words, it's almost a connotation of happy to get rid of. Connotation. In other words, it connotes a separation. Which means that what in Judaism, life, what we call life, how we experience life, is when the soul is in the body. When the soul leaves the body, that's what we call death. But when you really think about it, the body never had life and continues not to have life. The soul always has life and continues to have life. So there's merely, I don't want to say merely because the losing of a loved one is the most painful experience here, but when you look at it in that vantage point, to describe life and death is about the soul at one moment being in the body, and then when the soul leaves the body, that's what we refer to death. In fact, the Talmud tells us that sleep is a 60th of death. A 60th. What does that mean? Well, if death means the soul leaving the body, well, if a little bit of the soul leaves the body, then there's a little death.
How is it measured 60?
Well, that's a good question. That's a good question. In Judaism, in Judaism, we do talk about what sleep is. Sleep is a way in which the soul, a part of the soul, leaves the body and then returns upon awakening. That's why we say that famous prayer in the morning, Modani shehechzarte bibi nishmati. We thank God for returning my soul.
Which part is that?
Huh?
Which part that is the body? Is it the nefesh?
Oh, you're way ahead in Kabbalistic. We're going to get to that as well.
That's the morning prayer.
That's in the morning prayer. That's what we say. In other words, there is a form of the soul leaving the body and then returning. In terms that we use here in English, we speak about altered state of consciousness, where there's a little bit of a separation. Some people use, some drugs to help them with that separation. And some people are able to achieve that naturally. Or when you're sleeping, you have as well an altered state. Those different levels that we speak about, alpha, beta, theta, delta, those different levels is about an altered state of consciousness, which we come to recognize. So when we talk about the soul, we're talking about our true existence, our true identity. It's as if you close your eyes and then you feel yourself and then you recognize that that's your soul. When you open your eyes and look in the mirror, that's your body, but your soul is internalized. And which part of you is your soul? All of your intangible energies are your soul. The body is not an energy force. It's a vessel. But for many, many years, they looked at the mind or the brain as being the mind. Now they have two words. They have mind and they have brain. They believed at one point that the brain was the producer of consciousness. Now they come to realize, no, the brain is the receiver of consciousness. So, slowly, we begin to realize that the body is a shell in which somehow the soul has a perfect ability to enclose itself into and to function through those tools. Just like an artist, to take all of that artistic ability and be able to express it, you need the physical canvas and you need a physical paintbrush and you need the physical pigment and colors and so on and so forth. You need a physical device to be able to express all of your talents. Where's the talent coming from? Talent's not coming from the person's body. It's the gift that he has inside. If you give somebody that doesn't know how to draw all the tools, he's not going to come up with much. But in order for the gifted person to be able to express it, he needs the vehicle. He needs the vessel in which he can express his talent that he has. So when we speak about the soul, we're speaking about all those intangible energies that we have, which means from the power of intellect that we have, intellect comes from the soul. The power of sight doesn't come from the eye. Don't forget, the body, after a person dies, still has an eye, but the eye doesn't see. The sight, the power of sight comes from the soul. The power of hearing comes from the soul. The power to love, the power to be empathetic, the power to be humble, the power to be compassionate, all coming from the soul. The power to be comical. You're a joker. You have that type of personality. Everything comes from the soul. The body is there to express it. There was a doctor, his name was Raymond Moody. I don't know if anybody heard of him. And he also, he never believed in this afterlife or the ability of a soul that lives in the body. He was a very technical type of doctor, but he had too many experiences with people that had died officially, were flatlined officially while they were in surgery, and then came back and came with this very, very similar story that he himself wrote a book. I guess maybe he made more money than being a doctor, but he wrote a book. It was after 150 accounts that he came to realize that there is something there. There can't be everybody stating the same story of overseeing their bodies and feeling a sense of serenity and peace. They're all having, some of them have that tunnel with that light. Some of them even actually have the story of actually beginning to make their transition, following that light, beginning to see family members that had already transferred to the other side, being greeted. There's actually a story in the Talmud. I forgot who it was. I think it was a Rabbi Yosef who had died and come back. And his father, which was some great rabbi living in that generation, asked him, "What did you see?" So he said that I saw the world, the next world, but I saw it's completely backwards. Because those people in this that were living in this world, that were of the greatest respect given to them, over there, they were just very simple people. And then I saw people that in this world, nobody respect them at all, and they're walking around, with the utmost respect. So I saw a world that was completely turned around. And he said, "Son, you saw the world of truth. Our world is turned around. Where today the values or the models of what's considered successful and who the icons are and who our children are lauding after and following and idolizing is not necessarily going to be the way it's going to be in the next world." So let's begin with trying to describe what the soul is. First of all, if we look at the handout, which we're trying to answer the question, who am I and where does the soul come from and how is the soul prepared for its mission, we have a verse in Genesis. We see how God created the world. We see the manner in which He created the world, and we see the description of how He created the world. And here we find us a verse in Genesis that says, which we're all familiar with, He made him in the likeness of God. B'tselem Elokim bara oto. That in the image of God He made man. In other words, man was created in God's image. Which means that the soul of man somehow has a likeness to God.
So that's a reference to the soul, not to the body.
Mm-hmm.
But what about the
So what we find in the Bible is that when it comes to the creation of man, it was a two-part process, and everything else was created in a one-part process. Everything was created by God speaking and saying, let there be light, let there be a firmament, let the earth sprout out grass, and so on and so forth. And it became Baruch Shamar v'haya ha'olam. Blessed is he who spoke, and the world came to being. When it comes to the creation of man, we find something a little different. We find that he spoke, Naseh Adam, he spoke, and then Vayipach ba'apav, he blew into Adam's nostrils the soul of life. So right away we see that the human being is something different than all other existence. That somehow all other existence receives their life force through God's speech, whatever that is. I'm actually starting a course this Tuesday night called The Art of Communication. If anybody wants to attend, we can give you a deal. Whatever price you want to pay. The Art of Communication, which obviously deals with how to properly communicate and to have proper social skills and to be able to form relationships with people, with your family members, with your friends, how to communicate, obviously as it's based in Torah, as it's based in Judaism, and some of it is also based in Jewish mysticism. And in that course, it begins to open up our eyes and recognize, what does it mean that God spoke? What does it mean that with 10 utterances God created the world? Why did God use this metaphor of speech to create the world? And then we begin to understand our mode of speech and the power that we have as it resembles God's manner of creating the world. So somehow, through God's speech, the world received life. And the human being was created through speech and through God intensely blowing. Which, if you think about, what's the difference between speaking and blowing out a lot of air? You're emitting oxygen the same type of manner. Somehow you can speak for hours, but when it comes to blowing, it really tires you out because it's coming from a more internal place. So the reason why it tires you out is because it's more internal than external. So somehow the human being has a part of God that's more internal of God than external. Everything is created through speech, but the human being has something that is internal, which we'll talk about. What does it mean, internal and external? By God, isn't God infinite? How can God have an inner and an outer? That's the question that we're going to speak about as well. So, we were created in God's likeness. Okay, which means that the power of our soul means that it's a godly force. So we have a godly force. So if somebody would ask you the question, where's the greatest presence of God here in this world?
His soul.
Is the human being. That's the greatest presence of God in this world. Everything else has a presence, but it's a little spark that's represented by God's speech. It's external. It's a little spark of God that gives it life. Gives the animals life, gives the trees life, gives the stone and mountains life. So there is a presence of God in them, but the greater presence, which is reflected by God's blowing into Adam a soul of life, means that there's a greater presence of God within the human being than with the other categories of existence. Which will tell us that we were obviously the supreme choice of creation, that we do stand on the human being stands on a higher level than the animal kingdom. Which, of course, answers the famous Dennis Prager question that if you're out there, on some vacation with your dog that you raised since he was a pup, and he falls into the water, can't swim, and a total stranger falls as well in the water, you can only save one of them. Who would you save? The total stranger or your little puppy dog that you raised? Now, many people will say, well, who's to determine the value of life? This is a dog that saved me. This is a dog that that helped me grow, helped me through college. This is a dog that was there on my side, a faithful dog. This is the only dog that showed me unconditional love. What do I know about this stranger? And that's really what Dennis wanted to know, is how people view life, and if they would put a premium on human beings over and the animal kingdom. And for many, they said no. And they'll use the excuse of this, the dog has a soul and the human being has a soul. But there's a difference in the soul and the presence of God within the dog and the presence of God that's found within the human being, just based on just that verse that we spoke about, God blew into Adam's nostrils. Now, here's the Zohar. The next text that we're going to read is a text that's written in the Zohar. The Zohar is the classical text of Jewish mysticism, written by the famous Rabbi Shimon, the son of Yochai, which lived in the era right after the destruction of the Second Temple. He had to run away because the Romans wanted to kill him, so he ran to a cave, and he was there for 13 years with his son, and over there he authored the Zohar, which is a lot of the subject matters that we speak about. That's how we have the information. Now, it wasn't Rabbi Shimon's own personal subjective opinions and thoughts that he wrote down, but he wrote down what was transmitted from the previous generation. In other words, he was a student that was taught what was handed down from the previous generation of mystical concepts that was handed down from the previous generation all the way up to Moses. He was the first one that actually sat down and wrote a comprehensive work on these mystical teachings that were passed down since Moses, and he called it the Zohar, because Zohar means to illuminate. Because when you read about these abstract spiritual subject matters, it illuminates the world, recognizing what the purpose of everything is. You get a behind the scenes. Somebody one time asked, what does Jewish mysticism add to a person's life? Does it add anything? So the answer that somebody gave, which is a very good one, it's like a person that comes into a home and the lights are shut. They can't see anything, but everything is there. But they cannot identify anything. So they're walking around as if they're blind. They don't know where to turn. Where's the light? Where's the outlet? Where's the kitchen? Where's the sofa? It's all there. All of a sudden somebody turns on the light. What did that person add in that room? Nothing. But it illuminated the room. Now the person can see. What does Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, do? It illuminates the world because it makes you see the behind the scenes, the energy, the mahut, the essential core of existence, so that we have a better picture of what we're doing here, where we came from, and where we're going. Okay. So what is it written in the Zohar? You clothe me in skin and flesh. We often encounter the expression flesh of the person, implying that the real person is within and the flesh, which is the body, is only a vestment. So he writes that many times in the Bible, we speak about the flesh of the person, or you clothed me in the flesh, which means that me, the me, is separated from the body. The flesh is one thing, and the me is another. So,
Guf v'neshama.
Guf v'neshama, who am I? In fact, if you really want to answer the question, what does Jewish mysticism, in one word or one sentence, one expression, what does it answer? It answers what the guf and neshama is of everything. In other words, what the external and what the internal is. And, as we apply it to the human being, we refer to it as guf and neshama. We call it the body and the soul. And in objects that are inanimate, we might call it the chomer and the tzura, which is also very much like the substance and the form. In other words, there's the material substance that it's made out of, and then it's the form that it expresses itself into. The truth of the matter is that everybody in the world comes to recognize that everything really has this two-dimension. And if you want to be scientific, you can call it. There's the matter, and then there's the energy. Even in the business world, we talk about the product and the packaging. Every product has packaging, how it expresses itself to the consumer. So that when you're walking into a Barnes & Noble and you want to buy a book, a mystery. So you go into the mystery, the fiction section, and you see over there thousands of books. Which one do you pick to buy? Well, you can only choose one based on the body of the book. The soul of the book you're going to get once you read it. Now you're going to identify with the author. You're going to identify with the passions and the persona of the author that had written it. But when you're walking out, you obviously didn't read the book, or else you wouldn't buy it. You're only judging it by the exterior, by the body. By the, you look at it and you say, ooh, this sounds interesting. You read, one paragraph in the back flap, or you see the quality of page, or some people find it very attractive, the font, looks like easy reading, or some people might look at the publishing house, ooh, Simon & Schuster, okay, I'll pick this one. But you really didn't connect to the soul of the book, you're really connecting to the body of the book. And similarly, most people throughout life associate with the body of everything rather than the soul experience. Another statement that we'll mention here is what we say in the morning prayers. Elokai nishama shenatata bi tahorahi. The soul which you have given within me is pure. It's interesting that one paragraph, Elokai nishama shenatata bi tahorahi, the soul that you have placed within is pure. Then it says, Ata barata, Ata yatzarta, V'ata nafachta bi. You have created it, you have formed it, and you have blown it into me.
And I contaminate it.
No? That's your own personal opinion. You don't contaminate it. But that soul that we speak about is tahorahi, and then we speak about God creating it, forming it, blowing in. Which, that four-part definition, it's pure, you created it, you formed it, you blew it within me. As we'll continue on with the lesson, you'll see that represents the manner in which the soul emerged from God and came into this world and vested itself into your body. Those that study Kabbalah know that when God created the world, He created four realities called the four olamot, four worlds. Anybody know their names? There's the world of Atzilut, the world of Bri'ah, the world of Yetzirah, and the world of Asiyah. And we're going to talk about that very, very shortly.
Almost like Chabad.
Well, you'll hear what Chabad is within this context. And then finally, one last quote before we get into the meat of the matter. The soul, this is from the Kabbalist Rabbi Isaac Luria, known as the Holy Arizal, which was a famous Kabbalist that lived in Tzfat about 500 years ago. He lived at a time period right after the expulsion of Spain in 1492. His family came to Tzfat. Many migrated from Spain and they went to Israel. And the next generation actually is called the Golden Years of Tzfat, because Israel did not have a very great population until that point. And then so many people that were kicked out of Spain had moved back to Israel, and particularly Tzfat and Jerusalem all of a sudden became inhabited with many great righteous and scholarly Jews. And many of the great leaders and many of the great commentaries that we have on the Torah come from these that were living in Tzfat at the time. One of those, one of the greatest Kabbalists of all time, was Rabbi Isaac Luria, known as the Arizal. He writes as follows: the soul is a part of God from above, and it desires constantly to rise up to its Father's house. What does that mean? So the soul is a part of God and is always looking to go back.
It's on the loan.
You ever notice that there is a nature for things to gravitate back to their source? That's why children have a natural instinct to come to the parents, because subconsciously they came from the parents. It's a natural force that drives something to go back to its source where it emanated from. In many places in Judaism, in the Torah, we refer to the soul as a fire. It's the fire in you. One of the famous verses written in Mishlei, Ner Hashem, Nishmat Adam. The candle of God is the soul of man. What does that mean? The candle of God is the soul of man. Which means that somehow we're projecting the soul as being like a candle flame. And there are many different interpretations. What does that mean? Well, just like a candle gives direction, in a dark place it gives you a direction, a course of where to go. So too, it's the soul that's giving you the direction in this dark world. Why do I say it's a dark world? I know it's night right now, but the world is dark in terms of seeing the godly aspect of this universe. We don't see it openly. In everything. It's completely concealed from us. In fact, the very word olam, world, that's how you say world in Hebrew, where does it come from? Nelam? Nelam? What does nelam mean? Concealed.
Yeah.
The world that God created conceals His light.
But ne'elam actually is with an aleph, and olam is with ayin.
No, nelam is with an ayin.
Ne'elam also with ayin.
Uh-huh.
So, forgot my spelling.
That's okay.
Ne'elam.
It's like
Yeah,
mustar.
you're right.
Mustar.
How do you say a person that's a person? Nistar, right? Okay, nistar. So ne'elam means
It looks like disappeared.
disappear. Well, it refers to as if God disappeared. That's the world that we're living in. When we mentioned beforehand that when God created the world, He created 4 worlds, 4 realities. It doesn't mean 4 separate worlds, as if they're like geographically distant from each other. In Kabbalah, when it talks about 4 worlds, it means that God starts off with an energy of Himself, and that energy develops, evolves into a world that becomes more and more physical, tangible, with shape, with form, with characteristics, until it's completely evolved into a complete physical existence. The energy evolved into matter. That's a concept that everybody agrees with. Energy does evolve into matter. And the manner, the seder, the order, and how these energies evolved into matter is how God created this physical universe. It started with an energy of Himself, and then He allowed it to develop and evolve until it took on a physical form. Which means that there's one universe that God created, but the highest world is representing the most deepest and most internal energy force of this universe that brought it all about. And that's what we call one reality. And then when that universe of that godly energy all of a sudden began to take on some type of existence, where now it doesn't look like creator, it doesn't look like godly energy, but it looks like creation. Now the difference between creator and creation is God created creation. In other words, it's as if creation is outside of God. It's a creation of His. So the first reality is where the energy is expressed, and then that energy now takes on a created existence. Now that created existence then takes on form, and then finally that form begins to materialize and concretize, if that's a word, and now you have this physical world that began with the energies of God. Those are the four worlds, which means that God made one universe, and the four worlds are four simultaneous realms of consciousness of this world. In other words, if you look at the tree and you see a physical tree, you're in this lowest world. If you're here and you see the tree and you see an energy force, you might be in the higher world, a higher reality. In other words, the heavens are here. Everything is here. It's how you relate to the world that defines where you are, which reality you are. It's all like an onion with many layers. And the deeper layers, the deeper to the core of the onion, is the inner reality. And then the outer layers express the outer reality. So the physical mountain, as you see it as a physical mountain, that represents the lowest world. But if you were to identify the energy inside the mountain, all the way up to the godly energy that was first projected by God in the first world, then you are in that reality.
It's quite philosophical. I mean, deep thinking, to look at it. And you have to search for it to really...
Correct, yes, correct. So to explain, we all started. We went down this path because we made a statement that the soul is like a fire, and the fire. We explained why is it called a fire? According to one interpretation, because it leads us in this dark world. In other words, the world is dark because we don't see God in the world openly, and we have to somehow connect to that light inside to direct us, to maneuver us in this dark world, to make right choices. Because we don't have a God openly showing us what to do, and not inclining us to do it. We have free choice, and we could go down a wrong path. We can slip off and begin to live our lives for just self-centered purposes, and it might lead us to do corrupted things and evil things and hurt people because we want to live our lives and gain out of it. So what gives us the compass, the light to navigate through this dark world? We have our soul. We have to connect to our deeper element. But there's another interpretation, what Rabbi Isaac Luria is describing here. The soul is like a fire that's constantly looking to return back to its source. Meaning, if you look at life, if you look at the world, the fire, the nature of fire has a very, very enigmatic characteristic. And that is that the nature of fire is looking to separate from what's holding it down. Meaning, if you have a candle is a lump of wax that has a little thread inside called a wick, and then the flame is on top of it's burning, and as long as there's oil, there's a flame that can continue to burn. You ever notice that the flame is dancing, as if licking the air, as if swaying from side to side? It's as if it wants to pull itself away from the wick. Why? Why does the flame want to do that? If the flame is actually going to succeed in pulling itself off the wick, it doesn't exist any longer. Because what's giving it its life is while it's connected to the wick. And to the candle, if it's going to separate, then it's not going to have anything to hold it down, to have it into existence. Where is it looking to go? So in Jewish mysticism, it says that it's looking, the fire has a nature to want to go back to its source.
There's another interpretation because it's hot. and hot air rises, so it's on the right.
That's why it manifests itself in that scientific manner in its nature, but it's coming from a deeper place that it wants to leave. Why does it want to leave? It wants to go back to its source. God obviously created a source of fire, and it wants to leave, it wants to go back to its source. If it goes back to its source, it doesn't exist any longer. If it goes back to its source, it's like the sun ray. Imagine the sun ray, the Ziv Hashemesh. You have the ray of the sun. You know, the way the earth is situated with the sun, we don't get the full blast of the sun, or else we'd be consumed. We get just a ray, little ray that hits earth, and it's very intense. Any more, we would fry. One little ray, so intense, gives us all of that solar energy over here. We wouldn't be able to exist without that little ray that comes and hits the earth. Now suppose the ray is put back in its source. Meaning, just as we see a ray that might come into our windows, we can actually pick up a board and stop the ray. Right? Meaning that if we push the board closer and closer back to the sun, we could actually push the ray back towards the sun globe, which is the source. What happens if we succeed and we actually put the ray back into the sun? Does the ray exist there? It doesn't exist there. It's completely nullified within its source. Over there is just a sun globe. Where is all of its existence? All of its existence, it's when it's separated from the sun globe. I mean, it's still attached, but when it's far from the sun globe, it can be a whole existence. It can bring solar energy to an entire world. Wow! But if it goes back to its source, it's nothing there. You are nothing when you go back to your source. Imagine this soul. The soul that we have comes from God, comes from an inner part of God. It's God blew within Adam's nostrils the soul. So if the soul will be back where it came from, back within God, do you think your soul will be an independent, autonomous existence feeling itself? It's not. The soul, when it comes into the body, now it feels itself. Now it's a whole, it's a whole macher, as they say.
Warms the body.
It's a ganze macher, you know what I mean? Look, it has its own independent existence. Nevertheless, the soul in its essence is so spiritual and is so holy, it's not looking for self-preservation like everything else in life.
That's Kabbalistic.
Right. Everything else in life looks for self-preservation. Even the water. Now I'm not talking about the animals. The animals also are here to survive, to preserve, to be able to live on. But even things like water, you put water in a cup, it's contained. It wants to exist. The fire wants to leave. Where does it want to go to? Back to its source. But if it goes back, it doesn't exist any longer. Makes no difference. The soul is so inherently godly that it doesn't have that sense of, I want to live for me. I want to exist and delight myself in this wonderful experience. Meaning that the whole notion of self, I exist, and I look at the world as an opportunity for me to fulfill my desires, what I want out of life, what my dreams and aspirations are. That self-centeredness of every human being, that's not the true identity of what your soul is. And that is a very powerful statement, because naturally when you look at the human being, it is a self-directed organism. How did Freud define the human being? Like an animal, self-directed, self-propelled. In other words, here for survival, for self-preservation, to fulfill its self-will needs, but it has also a mind. It also has intelligence, so that's what makes the human being thoughtful at times, benevolent, philanthropist, and helping others, helping the less fortunate, because it has a mind. But who is the human being? Freud called it the id. The id is a self-propelled force. Nobody's denying that. That's the way most of the world identifies what a human being. After all, Who am I? And life begins with me. I decide how I want to live my life. I wake up in the morning and think about what I want to do, what will bring me joy. But understand, that's not who you really are. Who you really are is that soul that doesn't have an I. Doesn't have a self-oriented and self-directed motive. That true identity of yourself is here with one objective. I just want to be close to God. That's it. I want to go back to God. Where I came from.
It belongs to God.
It belongs to God.
Before,
Exactly.
It's alone in our body.
Mm-hmm. In other words, a soul that was extended by God comes into your body and has only one objective, whatever God wants. Not whatever I want, whatever God wants. Now, when the body is alive and we don't see the soul, we don't see it openly because we're in this world of nelam, we're in this concealed world. So we just feel our existence and we have to decide, all right, what am I here for? And it goes against the natural inkling or the natural inclination that every person wants to live and benefit out of life. That's what we all are. And it's completely against the true essence of your identity. You know, ego, they say, the word ego is an acronym for easing God out. You know, Passover, we speak about in the Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, Passover is not just about reflecting a story of the past. You know, that happened 3,300 years ago, where our ancestors were enslaved in Egypt, and then God brought them to freedom. Passover in Judaism, according to Jewish mysticism, is not just recounting the story of the past, but Passover is a way in which we can truly experience freedom today in our own personal life. In our own personal subjugation, imprisonment, bondage, enslavement that we all are. Because our soul, in our body, in a certain way, is enslaved. Why is it enslaved? Because it's not able to truly express itself the way it really wants. What is that called? That's called enslavement. Here you have a soul, your true identity, in a body that wants to serve God, wants to express like the Israelites. God told Moses, tell Pharaoh that they have to serve me. God sends the soul, serve me. And you have this body that is holding it back from truly expressing itself the way it wants to, of true freedom. Passover is about obtaining true freedom. Now what do we do on Passover? What is the main, law that surrounds Passover?
It's matzah.
That's right. You got to eat matzah. You can't eat anything leavened. What does that mean spiritually? The difference between leaven, between chometz and matzah, is the difference between something rising and something not rising. What does that represent? Ego. Meaning that if you want your soul to be fully free, you have to be as humble as a matzah. In other words, the ego disrupts the mission. The ego is what pulls us away from what we're really here to do. Whatever God wants, that's what I'm here to do. That's what, and we'll talk about the mission more next week. But the ego is the first point of where what we would call the evil inclination comes from. It starts off with, I'm living my life for me. Well, I might have a different goal than you. I might have my goal that I won't be happy until I become one of the wealthiest people here in California. And therefore I'm starting a chain of stores. And if I find out that you're going to open up a competition across the street from me and take away my customers, you are destroying my world, because this is what my life's about. My life is about becoming famous, rich and famous. And if you're going to destroy that, well, you're going to have to just be removed. Where do people get to that point of evil? It starts off with ego. Now, some people have a big ego, some people have a small ego, some people have a more tamed ego, and some people have a more vicious ego. But it all begins with an ego. It all begins with, life is about me. And that's where it all begins. And I always say this, that we're not really doing a favor for our children when we're giving them the Hallmark cards when they're 6 years old and we say, happy birthday, sunshine, may all your dreams and wishes come true. Because that's not what life is about. It's not about that your dreams and your wishes should come true. Life is not about me, it's about God. Okay, so let's finish off over here.
May I say something?
Mm-hmm.
I have another interpretation of the soul, which is a little more common. We all learn physics. And
Mm-hmm.
You've heard of Newton.
Yes,
And Newton said energy never dissipates or goes away.
that's right, continues
It
onward.
only changes forms.
Correct.
And the soul is the energy within us, but the special energy that was given to us by God.
Very good. Excellent.
Right? So if the body is tired and they cannot service
So the soul will transition into another.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
another
Very good.
state.
Excellent.
And we can also decipher the mahut, the essence of
Yeah.
the soul, with our individuality, because I believe that each one of us has a different type of soul.
That's right. We got to get to that point.
Because each one of us has a different fingerprint.
That's
Think
right.
about it.
Absolutely.
Each one of us has a different DNA.
Correct.
So each one of us has a purpose.
So we are going to quickly finish up this class today, because some of the foundation I've already laid, and now we just have to put in the rest of the puzzle pieces here.
Do we have an example?
Let me put it to you this way. We mentioned about the four realities. In order for God, for His presence to fit in the world, He had to conceal Himself. He had to diminish Himself. That's what we spoke about, because if you want to take something that is infinite and place it in a container, the container is going to explode. So the first act of creation brought about a Kabbalistic concept called tzimtzum. Tzimtzum means God had to contract Himself in order to be able to preserve the world. So the first act of tzimtzum brought about there. God created a space, and with space came time. And God projected an energy of Himself in that universe. And that's what we know in Kabbalah as what's referred to as the 10 Sfirot. 10 Sfirot is the image of God that He allowed to project of Himself into that first world. God really doesn't have an image. It's one of the 10 Commandments. You're not allowed to believe that God has an image. And yet we speak about, oh, look, the human being was created in the image of God. I mean, what are we talking about? Is this not a contradiction? Because God in His true self doesn't have an image. He's beyond image. But when He created the world, He made an image of Himself. And that's called the 10 Sfirot, and that's when we talk about, God's infinite wisdom. You see, in God's true infinity, you can't really describe Him by any description. You can't call, what is God? God is infinite wisdom. No, God is beyond that context of wisdom. That's what real infinity is. Infinite wisdom is the image of Himself in that first world. God's infinite love is one of those 10 Sfirot in the first world that are the building blocks of creation that brought everything into being. Those 10 powers of God brought everything into existence. Just like 3 colors can give you hundreds of thousands of different shades, colors on your TV. 3 colors. Remember those old TVs that had those 3 projected colors in the back? That big fat back, that it had. The lamps. 3 colors brought you thousands of different shades. Could you imagine 10 powers of God, 10 energy forces of God are able to produce billions of existence? Mixing and matching and evolving and developing. Look at the human being. The human being starts off with a little fetus, an embryo, and then somehow the souls multiply until these soul cells begin to develop. These cells evolve and develop into lungs, and these cells evolve and develop into heart. These cells develop into kidneys. All coming from the same place. from the same embryo, from the same fetus, from the same reproductive substance, somehow this miracle happens that as the cells begin to evolve during that process of the 3 trimesters, somehow it knows what course to go, to what faculties and what organs to make and develop out of them. Billions of cells, and they all come together to make a baby that has a bone structure with muscle tissue, with all the different organs, everything working in sync. Everything comes from the same place, but it evolves. That's just a human being. So, if you want to look at, because everything in life is all based on this bigger picture of how God created the world. So that first realm of existence is when God projected His image. The 10 sefirot, the 10 powers. Those 10 powers went through an evolutionary process of 3 more realities until this physical world emerged. Doesn't that sound familiar, like how a baby's born? Like first, you're projecting from yourself that reproductive substance where the embryo and fetus is now expressed out of you. And then it goes through the 3 trimesters, and all the definition and characteristics and all of the detail from that very spiritual embryo somehow evolves into a full viable child after three trimesters. It's kind of what the whole system of the first world, Atzilut, that first world when God projected His 10 energies, and then the world of creation, the world of formation. Remember that we spoke about in the beginning of the class when we read that prayer that we say in the morning. God, the soul that you have given place within me is pure. You have created it, you have formed it, and you have breathed it into me. It's describing from the essence of God the process of the soul going through these different dimensions. In the first dimension, it's completely pure. And then, in the world of creation, that soul became a created existence. And then the soul continued onward, and it took on form. Your soul has form to it. And then ultimately, it was able to now connect with your physical body. Normally, something as spiritual as a soul shouldn't be able to adapt to a physical body, but the soul does have this journey that it travels from the essence of God through these 4 worlds until it's able to vest itself into the body. Now, if you look at the second page, and I will get you out of here by 9:30. In Kabbalah, we find that there are 5 names to the soul. Why are there 5 names to the soul? Because we just finished mentioning that God took a part of Himself and projected it in the first world, and then into the second world, into the third world, into the fourth world reality, into our bodies. Which means that soul that came from the essence, that innermost part of God that God wanted to hint to us when He said, I blew it within you. It came from my deepest place. It came from the essence, and it went through this evolution of these worlds, and therefore the soul existed within the essence of God, and then it journeyed through the first reality, second reality, third reality, fourth, right into your body. That means that your soul has 5 different levels of consciousness, meaning that your soul has 5 different levels of how it views the universe. It has the vantage point of seeing it in this world where God is completely concealed, or the world above it where God is already more revealed there, or an even higher world where God is openly, those energies are open in that universe. So each of those realities allow for a different level of how the soul perceives God in the universe. And for that there are different names. So a regular simple person that's looking into the Torah or the prayer book and sees the word neshama. How do you translate it? Oh, that's the soul. The nefesh. Oh, that's the soul. The ruach, the spirit of the person. Oh, yeah, that's the soul. Every different word of the soul is representing a different level in which the soul perceives God, because it journeyed through all of these realities. The nefesh is the lowest level of the soul as it perceives God in this reality. The ruach, the spirit of the soul, is the soul, and you have your ruach is still within you. In other words, your ruach is not now deleted because a new existence emerged, a new step of this evolution occurred. Normally in evolution, every new stage cancels the previous one. Like a seed that you plant into the ground, and then it becomes a little sapling, and then you see over there bark, and you see over there, and eventually it grows into a tree, and then branches, and then you have fruit. Well, now that's a full-fledged tree. It's not a seed any longer. Because each step that it evolved into kind of cancels the previous step. It's no longer a seed, now it's a sapling. When it comes to the soul, all of those stages exist simultaneously. All of those worlds continue to exist simultaneously. Meaning, there's a part of you, if you connect to a deeper part of your soul, you can look at the tree and see God there. Ever notice how two people can look at the same tree? And one says, well, how could you deny God? And the other person says, what do you mean? All I'm seeing is a physical tree. One person sees the birth of a child and says, this is God. How could you deny God? Look at this child. And others don't. In other words, it's a manner of how you connect to your deeper identity to be able to view the world more like the soul rather than the body. But if we're going to remain on a superficial level, and we never probe within, and we never connect to our inner dimension, our inner reality, then we'll always live our life on a nefesh perspective, and then we don't get to see the inner dynamics of the world and the universe, or within ourselves. So if you look at the 5 levels of the soul, the 4 worlds, I had mentioned if you look at Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chai, Yechida, those are the names of the soul. Nefesh is again the lowest part, the physical, biological level of the soul. That's the lowest, that's what the soul evolved into right as it entered into your body. The Ruach is the spirit. It's the emotion of the soul that is connected to the reality that is right above us. I say the word above, again, I don't mean geographically above, I mean one step deeper, a deeper reality of this universe. Neshama is referring to the intellect of the soul, which is connected to the world of Bria, the world of creation. And Chaya, will, Atzilut, and Yechida is the place where it emanated from, which is God Himself. That's just, again, I'm just giving you a little, just whetting your appetite. I'm just throwing out some words over there just to give you just a little bit of a taste of what the soul is, where it came from, the journey of the soul, and so on.
Basically, it goes more complicated.
It is more complicated, and I'm not here to really delve into each level. And just as the five levels of the soul are corresponding to the 5 different realms that begin with God and the 4 worlds that follow. Okay. Sleeping recharges a soul. We mentioned that when God took a soul that has such a altruistic, ideal mission, ideal motive to want to only connect to God, then how do you expect a soul to come into a body where people don't follow it? It goes through pain. There's a lot of pain that the soul has when the person doesn't follow its cry, its directive. Who are you? You're everything together. You are a soul and a body, and you don't see God, and therefore you're just existing. So you have a choice of either just living life very superficially, or you can somehow probe within and try to find your true identity and recognize that this is who I really am. Sometimes we get to, we all get to feel sometimes the struggle of one side of me wants this, and then there's a little whisper that wants, something else. One side of me tells me, do it, you'll feel better, and the other side says, no, it's not really good. It's not the right thing to do. So we're constantly being pulled. The more we feed into our soul, the more we become our soul. The more we feed into our externalities, the more we become our externality. So whatever we feed, we become. That's ultimately what takes place. For the soul to live its life here, of course it's going to do whatever God wants, but it's very torturous to be here in this world. So that's why God created the concept of sleep. So that every single night, a part of the soul is able to leave the body, go back to where it came from, to all those realities, and come back. So it can breathe, so it can be back home in its environment. It can recharge itself for another day here in this God-forsaken world. And that's the reason why there's such a premium, why God, if God has a purpose for us, which we'll talk about next week, then why didn't He just make us go without sleep? 24 hours, we can work. Why did He make sleep a third of our lives? Because that's what God gives for the soul. It's compassion to the soul so that it can continue its job. Let's just finish up over here. The soul inside of you is as an interface between the infinite and the finite. The fusion of spiritual and physical. In other words, you're living in your body in a physical reality, but you have a part of you that reaches up to the essence of God. So you have that ability to be able to bridge the two, which we'll talk more about next week. The soul is that interface that bridges the two realities of spiritual and physical. The last few lines that we'll learn, the soul prepares for its mission. How is the soul prepared for its mission? So I just threw a few lines here. Number one, it is taught the entire Torah from beginning to end. That's number one. The entire Bible was taught to the soul before it comes into this world.
So we don't have to learn it in class. We get it in us.
Because the idea of learning, because we forget it when we emerge as a baby. Some people want to say is that little mark is a mark because there is sources in the Torah where right before the baby is born, the angel that teaches the Torah to the soul while it's in the womb taps upon the lip, and that's that little indentation over there, and the soul forgets the entire Torah. That's number one. So why? What's the point? The point is that it should always be familiar to you. Something resonates. You don't recognize that really your soul had studied it already once in the past. So when you hear something new and say, I kind of feel familiar with that concept, that's the reason why it's taught the entire Bible, entire Torah.
The question is, many people ask, when does the soul...
That's a very good question. Very good question. But let me just finish up over here.
Excellent.
These things. Number two, it says in Job, a light burns above its head and it sees from one end of the world to the other. As it is said, then his lamp shined above my head and by his light I walked through darkness. There's a light that's above the soul in the womb and it's able to see the entirety. Meaning, your life, the world that you're coming into, your soul saw, your soul knows the challenges, your soul knows what it's in for, what you're in store for, what you need to overcome, what you're going to be facing throughout life. It sees it all before you're born, and it agrees to it. It does not emerge from there before it is made to take an oath. This is again written in the Talmud. And then before it emerges, the angel says, listen, you see the whole world, you know what it's about, you know what you're in for, you know the challenges that you're going to be facing. I want you to swear to me, you're going to be righteous and you're not going to be wicked. And every one of our souls took that oath. You know why? Because when you take an oath, then you want to try your hardest to fulfill it. After all, you took an oath, for God's sake. So the soul inside of you, as much as it's challenged in life, it's really trying its hardest to fulfill that oath that it's made to be righteous and make the appropriate decisions. And then it says the final thing is, as soon as the woman gives birth below, the soul is complete and sent from its source to its body below. And this is what's written in Sefer HaPliyah. So there is, this is also just a little touch upon what all of the sources that are written in about the preparation of the soul into the body. Now, if you notice over here, it says that's when the soul completely emerges into the body. To answer your question, as the physical body begins to form, which is a product of the parents create the body and the genetic material so that the soul that comes in there gives it a certain characteristic, a certain shade, a certain lens. You know, the DNA, the spirit, the physical DNA that the parents, the biological part of the body from the parents, they're creating it. As the body is growing, there's a constant from the moment that it's an embryo. That embryo exists because there's a soul, from a point of conception, there's a soul power in there allowing it to go to the next stage. And as it grows through those 9 months, the transferring of that soul continues commensurate to the body, to the vessel, continues until it completely merges together with the body by 9 months, and then that's when it's told, now you can emerge. Forgets the Torah, it's prepared, it made its oath, it takes its oath that it's going to be righteous. So, I guess if you're asking the question because of the political debate of abortion or when life starts, we believe from the point of conception. Today, there's already talk about up to the first 12 weeks, up to the first 20 weeks, like that. To us, life begins at the point of conception, and that's when the soul begins to merge.
That's a surprise to me.
As my understanding of halakha is, until the baby is
30 days.
30 days old.
That shows
the life in being.
No, the halachot. There are laws.
And Jewish law doesn't.
There are law.
save them
Of
up.
course, right? Yes, correct. That is true. When it talks about the laws that pertain to the 30-day period, that establishes viability of the child. Not that that's when life begins, but what establishes viability of the child. If the child survives for 30 days, now that child, and there are certain laws that apply only to a child once it's viable, and when does viability begin? With 30 days. But the soul begins at the point of conception. Thank you very much for coming. Hopefully we'll see you here next week.